3 miles above the Florida Straits, a sensor is watching something that radar cannot see. Down on the water, a vessel is running nearly awash. 12 inches of hull above the surface, diesel engine buried below the waterline, hull painted the blue-gray of open ocean. The crew thinks they are invisible. They have optimized against the sensor they expect the United States to use. That is the last mistake they will make tonight. This is a hypothetical scenario built from real capabilities for education and entertainment. But every system you are about to see, every tactic, every detection method comes from documented real-world practice. Here is the question the crew of that semi-submersible cannot answer. What do you do when you hide perfectly from radar, and the platform hunting you does not use radar at all? The Florida Straits. 90 miles of water between Key West and Havana. On any given morning, the shipping lanes here carry container vessels, tankers, fishing trawlers. Hundreds of contacts on any surface radar picture, all of them generating returns, all of them creating clutter. That clutter is the strategy. A low-profile vessel. The narco-trafficking world calls it an LPVO or a semi-submersible, is built to disappear inside it. The hull sits so low that the radar energy from a Coast Guard cutter or a Navy surface picket literally sails over the top. The radar beam fires out at roughly 2 degrees above the horizon. The vessel's profile sits below that threshold. What the radar operator sees is nothing, or at best, a faint return indistinguishable from a wave. Think of it like trying to spot a piece of driftwood in a crowded harbor from the bridge of a container ship. You are scanning for vessels. Your eye skips right over it. Tonight, the operators of this particular hull have one more layer of cover: merchant traffic. 2 container vessels are within 3 nautical miles. A fishing trawler is running parallel on a heading toward Marathon Key. The radar picture is thick with noise. The crew is confident. 3 miles above them, a General Atomics MQ-9 Reaper disagrees. The Reaper has been airborne for 4 hours. Its MTSB, multispectral targeting system, the sensor turret mounted under the nose, is not looking at radar returns. It is looking at temperature. Specifically, it is reading the difference between the sea surface and anything warmer than the sea surface. Here is the physics. The Florida Straits in early morning runs at roughly 28 degrees Celsius at the surface. A diesel engine. Even a marinized, low-signature diesel running at reduced RPM generates exhaust gases somewhere between 150 and 400 degrees. That exhaust has to go somewhere. It rises from the stern in a plume. And that plume, against the background of 28-degree water, is as visible on an infrared sensor as a lit match in a dark room. There is a second signature. The hull displacing water creates a wake, a turbulence pattern, and a surface agitation that, because it is mixing deeper, cooler water with the surface layer, shows as a thermal disturbance. A faint, cool streak trailing behind the vessel's track. On radar, nothing. On infrared, a dotted line pointing directly at the contact. The Reaper operator, sitting at a ground control station that may be hundreds of miles away, sees both. The plume, the wake. A contact moving at approximately 8 knots on a heading of 185 degrees toward Cuba. Here's the complication. The Reaper has been tasked under a counter-narcotics support mission, which means its data feed is going to Joint Interagency Task Force South, JIATF-S, and from there to a Coast Guard Sector Command. The chain from detection to actionable intercept order involves multiple agencies, classification layers, and a coordination timeline. The contact is doing 8 knots. It has a finite surface window before the crew. Sensing something wrong or simply following protocol, takes the hull below the surface entirely and becomes a genuine submarine problem. The Reaper operator does the math. At 8 knots, the contact will reach Cuban territorial waters, 12 nautical miles offshore, in approximately 90 minutes. Beyond that line, a U.S. Coast Guard cutter cannot follow. The interdiction window is not generous. What surprises most people about this scenario is not the technology. It is the bureaucratic race running alongside it. The sensor works. The question is whether the coordination chain works fast enough to matter. I spent time going through open source JIATF, S reporting, and Coast Guard interdiction case summaries, and one detail kept coming back. In the semi-submersible cases that succeeded, the critical variable almost always came down to how many minutes elapsed between detection and the cutter receiving a valid vector. The Reaper is not the bottleneck. The link is. Tonight, the link holds. The Reaper operator marks the contact, assigns it a track number, and the feed goes encrypted to JIATF-S within minutes of detection. A duty officer validates the thermal signature. Not a fishing vessel, not a debris field, not a wave anomaly. The size, the heat signature, the wake geometry, the heading, the speed. All consistent with a semi-submersible LPVO on a southbound transit. The contact is flagged as a probable drug carrier. A Coast Guard cutter is positioned 42 nautical miles to the northwest on routine patrol. Its commanding officer receives the vector and the track data. The cutter goes to flank speed. Simultaneously, a call goes to the nearest aviation asset, an MH-60R Seahawk operating from a Navy frigate on routine transit in the area. The Seahawk crew gets a simple order: intercept coordinates, track bearing, and one instruction: do not let it submerge. Here is why that last part matters. A low-profile vessel on the surface is a Coast Guard problem. A vessel that submerges, even partially, even in shallow water, immediately becomes a Navy problem requiring sonobuoys, MAD gear, and potentially a P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft. The resource cost jumps by an order of magnitude. Time to reacquire goes from minutes to potentially hours. And a fully submerged hull in the shallow water of the Straits, threading between shipping lane noise, is not an easy contact to hold. The crew of the semi-submersible have one ace. They just need to get underwater before anyone reaches them. They do not know the Reaper is already there. They do not know they have been tracked for 37 minutes. They do not know the Coast Guard cutter is already at flank speed. The Reaper holds the track. And here is the question at the center of everything tonight. Can a sensor system designed for counterterrorism in the Middle East actually prosecute a maritime interdiction in the Florida Straits before a drug submarine disappears under the waves? The MH-60R Seahawk arrives on scene first. It comes in from the northeast, low and fast, and the crew can see nothing with their naked eyes. The vessel is nearly flush with the surface, and in the pre-dawn light, the hull blends with the water. But the Seahawk is carrying a forward-looking infrared sensor. The pilot lets the Reaper's track cue the flyer, slews it to bearing, and the contact appears immediately. The warm diesel plume at the stern, the cool wake trailing north, and the faint rectangular heat signature of the hull itself, just barely above sea temperature because the engine compartment is radiating upward through the deck. The Seahawk drops to 500 feet and makes a single low pass. Close enough that the crew of the semi-submersible, now aware something is overhead, can see the helicopter's navigation lights. They have a decision to make: submerge or run. They choose to run. Engine RPM climbs. The vessel's speed increases to 11 knots, and the wake signature on the Reaper's infrared feed becomes more pronounced, not less. Here's what the crew below the surface did not think through. Speed is the enemy of concealment on infrared. A slow hull at 8 knots produces a moderate thermal wake. At 11 knots, propeller cavitation increases, the wake widens, and the exhaust plume becomes turbulent and more visible. They just made themselves easier to track. Put yourself in the coxswain's position. You have spent weeks preparing this run, optimized every detail for invisibility against radar, running at night, staying inside shipping lane clutter. Now there is a helicopter overhead that clearly has you. What do? Dive and hope? The answer has consequences either way. The cutter arrives 22 minutes after the Seahawk. It comes in from the northwest, closing the angle of escape. The semi-submersible is now running southeast, directly toward Cuba, with a helicopter overhead and a cutter closing from the flank. The Seahawk makes a second pass and deploys a smoke marker directly in the vessel's path. Standard interdiction signal: heave to and prepare to be boarded. The vessel does not heave to. The Seahawk now has a decision of its own. Under applicable maritime law enforcement provisions, the helicopter crew can signal the cutter to fire warning shots across the bow. This is not a small decision. There are international waters implications, jurisdictional questions, and real uncertainty about what is actually aboard a vessel that is chosen to run. The Seahawk's crew holds. They stay with the contact, keep broadcasting position updates to the cutter, and keep the vessel under the flyer. The cutter closes to within 2 nautical miles. At this range, the semi-submersible is finally visible on the cutter's own radar. Not because the radar got better, but because the geometry is now favorable enough that the small return from the hull's minimal freeboard clears the noise floor. A radar that found nothing at 40 miles finds the contact at 2. The cutter launches its own small boat, a rigid hull inflatable, with a law enforcement boarding team. The semi-submersible crew, now with a helicopter directly overhead, a large vessel 2 miles behind them, and a rigid inflatable closing fast, makes the only decision left available. They throttle down. They stop. The boarding team is alongside in under 4 minutes. What they find aboard is consistent with what JIATF, S intelligence, and the thermal signature suggested. The cargo compartment, built into the hull amidships, contains bales of compressed narcotics. The load's street value, even accounting for uncertainty in these estimates, represents the kind of asymmetric calculation the smuggling network running this operation had apparently found favorable. The vessel is scuttled by the boarding team after the cargo and crew are transferred to the cutter. Standard procedure. Semi-submersibles are documented, photographed, and sent to the bottom rather than towed, which would be operationally impractical. The Reaper, now over 5 hours on station, turns north and climbs back toward its operating altitude. Total time from initial thermal detection to boarding team on deck, 61 minutes. The intercept window was 90 minutes. They had 29 minutes to spare. Here is the take that may get some pushback. The glamorous part of this story is the Reaper and the Flyer, and that technology deserves the attention it gets. But the uncomfortable truth is that the United States runs interdiction attempts against far more actual transits per year than it catches, and the vast majority of what reaches Caribbean transshipment points, including Cuban intermediaries, gets through not because the sensors failed. It gets through because there are not enough platforms to queue, not enough cutters to respond, and not enough hours in the aviation schedule to maintain persistent overwatch on every potential corridor simultaneously. The sensor solved tonight's problem. The sensor does not solve the coverage problem. There is a version of this exact scenario where the Reaper is tasked elsewhere. The MH-60R Seahawk is on maintenance, and the cutter is 30 minutes farther away. In that version, the semi-submersible makes its 90-minute window with time to spare. What do you think? Is the limiting factor technology, or is it the political will to fund enough platforms to use it continuously? Drop your answer in the comments. We read every one. There is one more layer to tonight's operation that does not make the interdiction report, but matters to the people who run counter-narcotics operations in this region. The Reaper spent 5 hours with its sensor on that hull. Every minute of that track is recorded data. The thermal signature of that specific engine configuration, the exhaust temperature, the plume dispersion characteristics, the propeller wake geometry, goes into an archive. The next hull built by the same network, running the same engine, will produce a recognizably similar signature. The Reaper's operators will have a reference point. This is the part of the sensor war that trafficking networks have not yet fully adapted to. They know about radar. They have optimized against radar for a decade and a half. They know to run low, to run at night, to stay inside shipping lane clutter. They do not yet have a systematic answer for infrared persistence, for the idea that a sensor 3 miles above them can record not just their position tonight, but a kind of machinery fingerprint that can be matched the next time the same hull, or a hull from the same builder, enters the kill chain. The enemy optimizes against the sensor he expects you to use. He loses to the one he forgot. Before you go, one thing about the MQ-9 Reaper that almost nobody outside the community talks about. The MTS-B sensor turret that found this vessel tonight was originally fielded for a completely different mission, finding insurgent IED emplacers in Iraq and Afghanistan by detecting the residual heat of recently disturbed soil. The thermal physics of hot soil in a cool night and a warm diesel plume against cool seawater are not the same problem, but the sensor architecture that solved one translated directly to the other. Military technology does not stay in the domain it was designed for. It migrates toward any problem where the physics matches. The next question, the one that keeps the people running these operations awake, is what happens when the next hull does not stay on the surface at all? What happens when it goes fully electric, runs entirely submerged for the last 30 miles on batteries, and presents no exhaust, plume, and no thermal wake to any airborne infrared sensor? That hull exists in prototype form. The Reaper caught tonight's run because the diesel engine had to breathe. The battery electric hull does not. That is the next problem, and it is a much harder one. If you want us to break down how the Navy would approach a fully submerged narco-sub in shallow water, MAD sensors, sonobuoys, the geometry of shallow water acoustic tracking, comment ONI below. If this kind of capability breakdown is what you come here for, hit subscribe. Every video on this channel is built the same way. Real systems, real physics, honest about what works, and honest about what does not. We will see you in the next breakdown.